Ever since the first trailer of Twilight Princess, there have been continuous questions on several missing elements not present in the final game. What happened to this moblin? Why does the Goma fight appear so different? Why was the Twilight Realm so desaturated back then? But the biggest point constantly raised by fans is what happened to the Lost Woods. These woods, which would appear as the literal second shot of the 2004 E3 trailer, featuring what was an open-ended woods full of animals, enemies, and various other creatures, making quite a sprawling, boundless forest. But once the game was released, this was completely missing. Is there any traces of it left? Was it simply cut for technical or design reasons? Or is there a much bigger rabbit hole that led to the eventual removal? Today on Cut Content, we shall explore the mystery of the cut lost woods of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button too to further support us and keep creating new videos. The beta forest of Twilight Princess was seen across 2 trailers and a handful of screenshots. What we saw via the first trailer was an endless sea of woods that looked like it would keep going on and on, containing enemies including bokoblins and bats via screenshots, but as well as a beta shadow beast, which would indicate that this area would have been under the domain of the Twilight at 1.2. But by the time of the second trailer, in about a year later, is when we saw this forest in a much more developed state, featuring a giant pond that Link can dive into. Where it would lead to is hard to say, but wouldn't surprise me if it led to an underground cavern, or even a hidden section of the forest. What we see next comes in the form of a forest statue, which has a striking resemblance to the same statues seen in the Sacred Forest Grove in the final game. More on that later. And animals. Cats, dogs, you name it. It was full-on animals that Link could interact with to make what was a rather lively natural forest. But we also start seeing more night creatures, including stallhounds, Stallfoes, and more of the Shadow Beast. Being that this was the Shadow Beast's second appearance, and also being at nighttime, it might even indicate that the Twilight Realm just put on a permanent nighttime when this trailer came out. As far as that goes, this is the extent of what Nintendo showed us of the forest. We might have also seen bits of it in the E3 2005 trailer, which again shows a forest at nighttime, but that might have simply been the Faron Woods, considering bits of Ordon Village were seen here too. Some might surmise as such that in just a few months between GDC and E3, the forest was cut, but it's complicated, and the rabbit hole is about to go a lot deeper. The existence of this forest in the first place may have come from the desire to do what they couldn't do in Ocarina of Time, as the game's producer Shigeru Miyamoto had suggested to Eiji Onuma when they started to make Twilight Princess, you should start doing what you couldn't do in Ocarina of Time. Make it so that Link can attack enemies while riding on his horse using the Wind Waker's engine, and make your decision based on how that feels. Which as a result, we got horseback combat, as seen in the first trailer. And what else we saw in that trailer was another callback to Ocarina of Time's development that just couldn't be completed, the beta Lost Woods of Ocarina of Time. The woods in that case had begun very early in development and went on being developed for at least another 2 years before being cut. Many believe the reason for this might have been that the N64 had trouble running such a massive forest, at least without the expansion pack, which this game by then was not going to use it once it stopped being a 64DD game. As a result, the desire for these woods in Twilight Princess may very likely be a part of trying to do what they couldn't do in Ocarina of Time, as the GameCube should be plenty powerful to run this. But then one wonders, isn't it looking a little too similar to Ocarina of Time then? Well, that might have been actually intentional. Eiji Onuma has gone on record to say, back then, we considered making it the sequel of Ocarina of Time some years later. But then we thought of first-time players who wouldn't understand a thing if you started out as a wolf, so we changed it and had human Link from the start. In other words, it is quite likely that reviving the idea of what they couldn't do in Ocarina of Time was simply because it was going to be a sequel to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, featuring a grown-up Link in the child timeline. Thus, this forest would be the Lost Woods we saw in the final game, given truer form to their beta version. What this also means is that a location like the Kokiri Forest would also have to exist then, which, taking in elements of Ocarina of Time, was going to indeed be the case, as they even had made a new design for Sheik that they were going to use, but got repurposed for Super Smash Bros. Brawl instead. And quite frankly, we also got this single piece of concept art of what is Link's treehouse, reminiscent of how it looked in Ocarina of Time, being way up a tree with that ledge that was next to it that featured a fence, in what looks reminiscent of the Kokiri Forest. Of course, one might say that this means nothing, as Link also had a treehouse in the final game in Ordon Village. About that, here's how Link's treehouse looked in E3 2005 in Ordon Village. It was simply going to be a very normal house. But that's the thing. Ordon Village is an interesting case, as it actually more or less was made for E3 2005. Sub-director of Twilight Princess, Kentaro Tominaga, has spoken in an Iwata interview stating, "In the version we showed at E3, you were able to play through the first village in the game, but even though that was specifically designed for E3, because it was a self-contained level, the task of integrating it into the main Zelda game involved making a lot of adjustments, and we didn't quite know what to do." Now, it isn't a stretch to say that levels are modified for demo presentations, so you get a little taste of the game without distractions, and as well elements not available early on. But then there's also this quote by Eiji Onuma regarding the E3 2005 as well, stating it would start off setting up the idea that Link is a rancher, or a wrangler, who takes care of the goats, and also setting up his relationship with people in Toru Village. So now we run into a few contradictions here. On the one hand, you have the so-called beta Kokiri Forest that supposedly featured this treehouse, and Ordon Village, which was made for E3, which featured a regular house for Link, but yet was being called by Onuma as the starting area. What this may tell us as a result is that between the few months of GDC and E3 2005, and possibly last minute at that, the whole idea of the Ocarina of Time sequel was dropped in favor of a new story altogether. Therefore, what this Ordon Village may represent is either a conversion of what was the Kokiri Forest at one point into this village of regular Hylians, which kinda would work considering the rivers that split the town, the slopes, the Kokiri crest literally being everywhere, or that it was just simply a separate village that was haphazardly converted into a starting area for E3, which, as Tominaga said, was in fact hard to integrate into the game after. And that's the key point. It was hard to integrate, meaning when the integration was about to happen, things had to change. Considering if there really was another location more related to Ocarina of Time like the Kokiri Forest here, its story beats, dialogue, quests, and its surroundings had to be redone from scratch for this new starting town. Which, speaking about the surroundings, that is the bigger part, as they were made with the previous town in mind, whether it be redesigned the paths and locations in its surroundings to meet the new paths of the town, let alone being that the Kokiri Forest is a location that is next to the Lost Woods, it is possible that without the Kokiri there, they may have felt it wouldn't make sense for a village of Hylians to be next to a large set of woods where one could get lost in, as the name states, especially since the beginning of the game now would require one to venture through the woods, and the original Lost Woods might have been a little too intimidating and open for what was essentially the game's tutorial, and so therefore for these reasons, it might have been removed. What replaced it, as many have surmised over the years, may have been the Faron Woods and the Sacred Forest Grove, which, if my theory holds true, this would very much be the case. In fact, I would even theorize that the fishing hole was a part of this, as a screenshot exists from that time of Link in his village clothes fishing on a boat around that fishing hole. And to remind everyone, the fishing hole isn't supposed to appear until much later into the game, which guess what was in the E3 2005 build of Ordon Village? That same boat, which might have connected right into the forest, leading to the fishing hole. But otherwise, I would imagine that these original woods would serve the purpose that they did story-wise in Faron Woods. And yet, via another section in there, you would also hit the Sacred Forest Grove. And with the latter, we may even have actual evidence of that. Remember that giant statue creature seen earlier from the Beta Forest? And remember how I mentioned it looked eerily like the one in the Sacred Forest Grove? Well, that area might have been the original Sacred Forest Grove that Link walked into and was about to go through that same trial he does in the final game. Granted, likely not towards getting the Master Sword if this was the original Ocarina of Time sequel story, as that would have been resting in the Temple of Time, but rather it would have been to get something else. And to further crux that point, over the years, some have taken note of the very woods behind the Master Sword's pedestal, specifically with how it's laid out, varied and quite abundant. At first glance, it would look a lot like the Beta Forest, but in the final game, it looks more like a forest than even Faron Woods. Which once again, if my theory is true on the Sacred Forest Grove being converted from a section of the original Lost Woods, then this section might have even been perfectly ripped from that forest and kept into the final game, including its backgrounds here. But now the final question arises. Is there anything of the old forest even left in the game's data? And the answer is yes, actually. But not in the way you think. If we are to look at the internal maps of the game, and especially via the Wii kiosk demo, there are actually several deleted maps, some of which are simply E3 versions of levels, whether it be a dungeon, the 2005 Hyrule Field, or even test maps. But the one to stand out most is called F_SP105 L1 Force Field. This is a standalone map that appears to have at least 7 rooms to it, 3 of those being Twilight versions of them, which would match what we saw in the E3 build. But seeing as there are at least a total of 4 rooms here, this would mean that the forest would likely have been split up into separate sections still. Ironically, this would perfectly fit with what I've stated would likely be in the original Beta Forest, being the forest center that likely became the Faron Woods, the Sacred Forest Grove, the Master Sword pedestal, or what it was originally, and the fishing hole. As mentioned earlier, the Master Sword room likely wouldn't have been a Master Sword room actually, if it was following the Ocarina of Time sequel idea. So it might have been another important event, one which likely wouldn't have been accessed during the Twilight occupying the area, and thus that part likely never would have received a Twilight section made for it. As some might say, this was just deleted parts of an existing map. But nothing else has the same map code of F_SP105. Faron Woods is F_SP108, the Sacred Forest Grove is F_SP117, and the fishing hole itself being F_SP127. In other words, none of the other forested locations share this designation, and therefore it can be understood that this is very likely the Beta Forest we have longed for. However, even further, the very E3 versions we saw in the trailer appear to have their own maps that were made just for the trailer. 4 of them actually. One of these specifically having the word cat in it, which would obviously be referring to the cats seen here, as they probably did want to show the lively nature of these woods. The other 3 are not so obvious, but I wouldn't be surprised if Link fighting the Shadow Beast in his human state was one they made just for the trailers, as they might have wanted to avoid showing Wolf Link this early on, and thus they cheated the game. Now it should be understood that a lot of this is just a theory in the end, based on stitching interviews from staff, several screenshots, and data mining the game for evidence. Therefore, nothing can be 100% concrete. What we know for sure, however, is that these woods existed up till E3 2005 at least, featuring such creatures, this pond, and this giant that was part of the Sacred Forest Grove. But regardless, putting that all together, I do personally feel that there is at least some truth to this theory, and the deep rabbit hole we went through may have happened very early on in production. And quite frankly, over the years of discussing it with many others in the community, many have thought of these theories too to an extent, some of which being quite obvious, others being on shakier ground. However one wishes to interpret these events is up to the individual. But until we stumble upon what might be Twilight Princess's holy grail in cut content, we might never know what the full truth was. And if it does ever come into possession, I'll definitely plan to cover it. So make sure to hit the subscribe button, for I'll plan to be back for more Zelda and other games cut content soon. Hit the like button and comment below on what is your personal theory about the beta forest of Twilight Princess. So everyone, thank you for watching.